For over 9 minutes, a woman fought for her life. She screamed. She begged. She said his name more than once. And then, the line went dead. Nearly an hour later, police arrived at her home. They walked to the front door, knocked, and waited. No movement. No sound. No sign that anything was wrong. So they turned around, got back into their patrol car, and drove away. Inside that house, a faucet was still running. Water spilled silently over the edge, creeping across the floor, inch by inch. And just beyond the bathroom door, a nightmare sat undiscovered. 2 days later, her family would step inside that same home, expecting nothing more than a normal visit. Instead, they would find something so disturbing. Even seasoned detectives struggled to process what they were seeing. But what makes this case truly haunting isn't just the way it ended. It's how many chances there were to stop it. Because this may have been a murder that never had to happen. This is the tragic story of Deanna Cook.
911, this is Pat. What's your emergency?
I have a stalker. He's been out here in his house son all day long. He's out here across the street watching my house. I don't know what his plan is. You can look up my name, you can see it's 100,000 by a thousand complaints. But ain't nobody doing nothing. And then he's already tried to kill me 3 times, so I'm really just fed up with this. I can't keep moving and changing my life because of this.
Deanna was the kind of person you noticed the moment she walked into a room. Not because she demanded attention, but because her energy filled every corner of it. As the oldest of 4 sisters, leadership came naturally to her. From a young age, people looked to Deanna for direction, for reassurance, for strength. She wasn't just dependable, she was driven. On the track field, she pushed her body past its limits, earning a reputation for determination that few could match. Winning mattered, but what mattered more was proving to herself that she could endure anything. That same fire carried into every part of her life. Friends described her as vibrant, fearless, impossible to ignore. Deanna didn't do anything halfway. She lived loudly, loved deeply, and dreamed without restraint. But if there was one role she treasured above all others, it was being a mother. Her daughters were the center of her universe. Every decision she made, every plan for the future, somehow traced back to them. She wanted more for her girls. More security, more opportunity, more joy than she'd ever known herself. And quietly, in the late hours of the night, when the world finally slowed down, Deanna worked on another dream. She was writing a book. Page by page, she poured her thoughts onto paper, determined that one day her voice, her story, would reach far beyond the walls of her home. Friends often said Deanna lived at full volume, which is why what happened inside her home feels almost impossible to comprehend. Not long before that day, Deanna had moved into a new house. It wasn't just larger, it was a symbol of progress, of independence, of a life she was building with her own hands. The rooms echoed with possibility. The windows invited in warm morning light. It was the kind of place where memories were meant to grow. To her daughters, it wasn't just a house. It was a castle. It was safety. Or at least, they thought it was. The morning everything changed began like any other. There were no warning signs. No sudden sense of danger. Just routine. Just life. Early that day, Deanna spoke with her mother on the phone. Before they hung up, the two shared a quiet prayer, something they had done countless times before. Their voices were calm, familiar, wrapped in love. Neither of them knew those would be the last words they would ever say to each other. Hours passed. And then, something small happened. Deanna didn't answer a call scheduled for 10 a.m. At first, it meant nothing. People miss calls all the time. Maybe she was busy. Maybe she stepped out. Maybe her phone was on silent. But then came the second break in routine. The money she was supposed to drop off never arrived. Still, no one panicked. Not yet. Concern, at this point, was just a faint whisper in the back of the mind. Until it grew louder. Because Deanna missed church. For those who knew her, this wasn't just unusual, it was almost unthinkable. Showing up was part of who she was. Reliable. Present. Steady. Now, calls were going unanswered. Texts remained unread. And with every passing hour, that quiet whisper of concern began transforming into something heavier. Something harder to ignore. By the time her family started asking, "Has anyone heard from Deanna?" An uneasy feeling had already begun to settle in. The kind of feeling you can't quite explain, but one your instincts recognize immediately. Something wasn't right. By the time Deanna's family decided to go to the house themselves, concern had already turned into dread. Something was wrong. They could feel it. And before they even reached the front door, they saw it. Water. It spilled down the driveway, slipping along the curb, slowly crawling into the street as if the house itself were bleeding. For a moment, no one spoke. They just stared, trying to make sense of something that made no sense at all. Then they heard it. A dog, barking from inside. Not the excited bark that greets familiar footsteps. This was sharper, urgent, relentless. The kind of bark that says something isn't right. As they moved closer, another detail settled in. A smell, faint at first, almost unnoticeable. But the longer they stood there, the harder it became to ignore. They knocked. No answer. Knocked again. Still nothing. The door gave way, and the moment it opened, the sound of running water rushed out to meet them. Steady. Endless. Somewhere inside the house, a faucet was still pouring. They stepped in cautiously. Water soaked the floor. With every step, their shoes sank into it, cold liquid wrapping around their ankles. The house felt wrong. Too quiet, yet somehow too loud at the same time. The barking continued, echoing through the halls. They called her name. Once. Twice. No response. As they moved deeper inside, the damage became impossible to ignore. Doors hung crookedly from their frames. Wood splintered. Drawers disturbed. It looked less like a home, and more like the aftermath of a struggle. Their pace slowed. Instinct taking over. Every step heavier than the last. They passed the living room. Then the hallway. Until they reached the bedroom. The bed was unmade, but untouched. No sign of her. Just an unsettling stillness that seemed to press against their ears. And then, they heard it more clearly now. Water. Close. Very close. It was coming from the bathroom. They approached the door. Stopped. For a brief moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Because deep down, they already knew. The door creaked open. And that's when they saw her. For a moment, their minds refused to understand what their eyes were seeing.
What is it?
We had a vivid picture of how our mama died, so we get to relive that picture.
That picture still haunts Deanna's family, and so does another 911 call that came in just one day before she was brutally murdered.
Well, 911, this is Pat. What's your emergency?
I have a stalker.
Deanna lay motionless in the bathtub. Water surrounded her, unnaturally still now, as if even it had gone quiet. The room felt frozen. No one spoke. No one moved. Shock has a way of stealing sound from the world, leaving behind only a heavy, unbearable silence. This wasn't supposed to be real. Just days earlier, she had been laughing, making plans, living her life with the same unstoppable energy everyone had come to know. And now, everything about her was painfully still. The kind of stillness that tells you, someone isn't coming back. Calls to 911 were made with trembling hands. Voices cracked as reality began forcing its way in. Soon, the house filled with strangers, officers, investigators, quiet footsteps, low voices. But nothing could soften the weight of what had already been discovered. For her family, time fractured into a before and an after. Before they opened that bathroom door. And the life they were now being forced to imagine without her. At first glance, it looked like a tragic accident. A drowning. A terrible, unexplainable loss. But investigators are trained to notice what others might miss. And it didn't take long for them to realize. Something wasn't right. The position of her body. Subtle marks that told a different story. Signs that this scene had not unfolded naturally. The medical examiner would later confirm the truth. She hadn't drowned. She had been strangled. The water had only been left running afterward, quietly spilling over, hour after hour, as if trying to wash away what had happened inside that room. But it couldn't. Because violence always leaves something behind. As detectives began piecing together Deanna's final hours, a darker picture started to emerge. One that suggested this wasn't random. This wasn't an accident. This was personal. But what chilled investigators even more was that the killer had already been warned to stay away. As investigators dug deeper into Deanna's life, one name surfaced again and again. Not a stranger. Not a mystery. Someone who had once promised to love her. Her husband.
Vecchio Patrick has an extensive criminal history, including assault, aggravated robbery, drug possession, and resisting arrest.
Delvecchio Patrick wasn't a stranger. He was the man Deanna once trusted with her heart. What began as a marriage had, over time, become something far darker. Even after their marriage ended and a restraining order was put in place, he refused to let her go, stalking her, harassing her, and repeatedly warning that he would kill her. What once looked like love had long since turned into something far more dangerous. Behind closed doors, the relationship was marked by control, fear, and escalating tension. Arguments that once ended in silence began ending in intimidation. Then came the abuse. Not always visible, not always reported, but very real. The kind that slowly reshapes a person's world, teaching them to measure their words, to watch their steps, to live in a constant state of alertness. Eventually, Deanna made a decision that takes enormous courage. She left. And when she did, she didn't just walk away, she sought protection. A restraining order was put in place, a clear legal boundary meant to keep him out of her life and away from her home. On paper, it was a safeguard. In reality, it became just another line he refused to respect. The calls started. Too many to ignore. Messages that shifted between anger and desperation. Apologies followed by threats. Promises to change, followed by behavior that proved otherwise. Then came the stalking. He showed up where he wasn't supposed to be. Watched from distances that felt far too close. Appeared without warning, a constant reminder that separation didn't always mean safety. Deanna reported it. Again. And again. Each call to police was more than a complaint. It was a record of fear. A documented pattern that, piece by piece, revealed how serious the situation had become. Friends would later say she was trying to do everything right, following the system, asking for help, creating distance. But sometimes, distance isn't enough when someone refuses to let go. Then the situation escalated. One encounter turned especially frightening when he allegedly used a taser on her. A moment that crossed an undeniable line. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was violence. And yet, somehow, the threat continued to hover just outside the reach of real prevention. By now, the pattern was impossible to miss. Warning signs stacked on top of warning signs. Incidents building like pressure behind a sealed door. The kind of pattern that, in hindsight, makes people ask a devastating question. How was this allowed to continue? Because when you trace the timeline, it begins to feel less like a shocking tragedy, and more like a disaster waiting for the moment it could finally break through. Just 3 days before her death, she posted online about a stalker. What Deanna's family didn't know was that the moment her attacker entered the house, she dialed 911. It happened fast. 1 second, she was inside her home, a place that was supposed to protect her. The next, that safety was gone. Somewhere between fear and instinct, her hand reached for the phone. 3 numbers. A lifeline she believed would bring help rushing toward her. When the operator answered, Deanna was already in distress. Her voice trembled. Breath uneven. Words struggling to come out fast enough. She didn't hesitate. She named him. Not a guess. Not uncertainty. She told them exactly who was there. Exactly who was hurting her. There is something uniquely terrifying about listening to someone realize, in real time, that they are in mortal danger. You can hear the moment fear takes control. The moment survival becomes the only thing that matters. Her voice rose. Then broke.
It's clear who was there with her and who was doing this.
Oh yes, it was very clear.
Please don't take me out. Don't take me out, please. Please don't take me out. Please. Don't take me out, please.
She pleaded for help. Again. And again. At one point, her words tangled together, panic swallowing syllables as she tried to stay on the line, tried to stay heard, tried to stay alive. In the background, chaos. Movement. The unmistakable sounds of a struggle. Then her breathing changed. Sharpened. Forced. As if the air itself had suddenly become difficult to reach. Investigators would later note the sounds that followed, fragments of terror captured in seconds that no one who hears them ever forgets. Gasping. Choking. Water running somewhere nearby. An eerie, steady presence beneath the panic. The operator tried to regain control of the call, but fear doesn't follow instructions. And then, in the middle of it all, her voice vanished. No goodbye. No final words. Just the abrupt absence of someone who had been fighting with everything she had. And suddenly, silence. The line remained open, but the sounds were gone. For a moment, it was as if time itself had paused. But on the other end of that call, a clock was already ticking, every second widening the distance between danger and help. Because police didn't arrive for nearly 50 minutes. What should have been the beginning of her rescue, instead became the start of a devastating chain of failures. The call was entered into the system, but not as the highest level of emergency. Despite the terror in her voice, despite the sounds of violence, despite the fact that she had named her attacker, the situation was assigned the wrong priority. Critical details never reached the officers being sent to the house. They weren't told the full extent of what was happening inside. They didn't know a woman might be fighting for her life. So the response that should have been urgent became routine. Minutes passed, then more minutes. And while time moved normally for the rest of the city, inside that house, every second mattered. As officers made their way toward her address, they stopped along the route. Once, to check on an alarm. Another time, for a brief errand. Individually, the delays may have seemed small. But in emergencies, small delays can carry enormous consequences. By the time they finally arrived, nearly 50 minutes had slipped away. They approached the home, knocked on the door, waited. No answer. From the outside, nothing appeared obviously wrong. The blinds were closed. The house was quiet. A dog barked somewhere within, but barking dogs are not unusual. Without the full context of the call, without understanding what may have been unfolding just beyond those walls, they made a decision. They left. No forced entry. No sweep of the property. No attempt to look through every window. Just a report that no one had answered the door. And then, they drove away. What no one could confirm, what no one could ever truly know, was what was happening inside the house at that exact moment. Whether the water was already running, whether the struggle had just ended, or whether, somewhere in those silent rooms, Deanna was still alive, still waiting, still hoping help was on the other side of the door. She may have still been alive. When they walked away, the trial began more than 2 years after Deanna's death. For her family, it had already felt like a lifetime. Now, everything came down to a courtroom. Every detail of her final moments would be examined, questioned, challenged, and in some cases, twisted. The defense moved quickly to shape their narrative. They suggested Deanna had not been thinking clearly, that the terror heard on the 911 call wasn't real, but the product of hallucinations. Toxicology reports confirmed PCP in her system, and the defense leaned heavily into it. They argued the drug could distort reality, could create paranoia, could make someone believe they were being attacked, even if they weren't. Then came the psychological autopsy. Experts spoke about her past struggles, mental health diagnoses, periods of instability, old wounds brought back into the open, all to plant a single seed in the minds of jurors. Reasonable doubt. The implication was chilling, that somehow, Deanna had been responsible for what happened inside that home. But the prosecution wasn't finished. Piece by piece, they dismantled the narrative. Because hallucinations don't explain history. And Deanna had a long, documented history with a man sitting at the defense table. Witness after witness took the stand. Friends, family members, people who had seen the bruises, heard the threats, watched the pattern escalate. They spoke of fear that had become part of her daily life, and of a man who refused to let her go. Then the courtroom heard something even harder to ignore. A former jail employee testified that the defendant had admitted to the killing while behind bars. Not speculation. Not interpretation. An alleged confession. Still, he showed almost no reaction as the testimony unfolded. No visible remorse. No grief. At times, he appeared detached, as if the proceedings were little more than an inconvenience. And then prosecutors revealed a detail that sent a ripple through the courtroom. While awaiting trial, he had gotten a tattoo. It depicted a woman trapped in flames, screaming. To many, the imagery felt disturbingly specific. A haunting echo of how Deanna had been found. The defense claimed it represented a music artist. But for those who loved Deanna, the resemblance was impossible to ignore. By the time closing arguments ended, the emotional weight inside the courtroom was almost unbearable. Jurors disappeared to deliberate. Hours passed. Then finally, movement. The courtroom filled again. Family members held hands. Some bowed their heads. Others stared straight ahead, bracing for whatever came next. The verdict was handed to the judge. A pause. The kind that seems to stretch far longer than it actually does. You could hear shifting in seats, quiet breaths, the faint rustle of fabric. And then the word came. Guilty. Emotion broke through instantly, but even in that moment, the judge urged restraint. For Deanna's family, it wasn't celebration. It was something closer to release. A confirmation of what they had known from the very beginning. But one question remained. How much time would he serve? Prosecutors asked for life. The defense argued for leniency, as little as 5 years. The jury returned with their decision. 85 years. Not technically life, but long enough that freedom would likely never feel within reach again. For many families, a guilty verdict brings a fragile sense of closure. A moment to begin breathing again. But what happened next reopened every wound. As Deanna's daughters stood in the courtroom to speak, gathering the strength to face the man who had taken their mother, all eyes turned toward him. Most people, when confronted with that kind of pain, look down. Show something. Regret. Shame. Humanity. He did none of those things. Instead, he laughed. Not a nervous smile. Not disbelief. Laughter. Cold. Detached. Unbothered. The sound alone was enough to make people shift in their seats. Enough to send a visible ripple of disbelief through the room. And then, as if the moment weren't already unbearable, he raised his hand and extended his middle finger toward Deanna's daughters, toward the young women forced to grow up without their mother. It was a gesture that said more than words ever could. In that instant, any lingering question about remorse seemed to evaporate. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the life that had been stolen, only defiance. Family members would later describe him as emotionless, unreachable, a man who appeared untouched by the devastation surrounding him. Even seasoned prosecutors, people who had spent careers facing violent offenders, struggled to comprehend the lack of reaction. Some would say they had rarely seen anything like it. Because violence is one thing, but indifference can feel even darker. For Deanna's family, the verdict ensured he would spend decades behind bars. But nothing inside that courtroom could undo what had already been done. And no sentence could give those daughters their mother back. But as the courtroom doors closed, a heavier question refused to go away. What if this hadn't just been a murder? What if it had also been a failure? Because when investigators began retracing the timeline, the gaps were impossible to ignore. A desperate 911 call. Critical details missing from the dispatch. An emergency categorized too low. Officers unaware of the true danger. A knock on the door. And then a decision to leave. For Deanna's family, the grief quickly turned into something else. Determination. They filed a wrongful death lawsuit, arguing that the system meant to protect her had broken down at nearly every stage. That the outcome might have been different, if urgency had matched reality. Public scrutiny followed. Questions flooded in. How could a call filled with terror not trigger the highest possible response? Why weren't officers given the full picture? Could better communication have saved her life? At the center of the storm was the 911 operator who answered Deanna's call. Some blamed her directly. Others pointed to a deeper problem, an overwhelmed call center, short on staff and stretched beyond capacity. The operator would later defend her actions, saying she followed the training she had been given, believing help was already on the way. But belief doesn't rewrite timelines. And it doesn't quiet the question that haunted everyone. What if another operator involved that day was eventually fired? Others faced disciplinary action. And under mounting pressure, the city began taking a hard look at its emergency response system. Policies were reevaluated. Staffing increased. Procedures updated. Domestic violence calls were given greater priority, treated with the seriousness they demand. City leadership would later admit what many already felt. The system had failed her. From dispatch, to response, to the fragile safety net she had trusted. Out of tragedy came reform, but for Deanna's loved ones, the changes carried a bittersweet weight. Because progress often arrives too late for the person who needed it most. Her case also ignited wider conversations about domestic violence. About how often warning signs are missed. How many victims report threats, only to be told there isn't enough evidence to act. How leaving an abusive relationship is statistically one of the most dangerous moments in a victim's life. Deanna had done what people are told to do. She reported him, documented the threats, obtained a restraining order, asked for help, again, and again, and again. Yet somehow, danger still found its way to her door. Her story became more than a headline. It became a case study, a cautionary tale, a call for systems to move faster, listen harder, and treat fear as the emergency it often is. Because behind every policy change, every new protocol, every training update, is the quiet understanding that they were written in response to a life that cannot be replaced. In the years after Deanna's death, her absence never grew smaller, but neither did her impact. The little girls who once saw their home as a castle were forced to grow up far too quickly, learning how to navigate a world that no longer had their mother in it. And yet, they refused to be defined by what was taken from them. They chose strength. Step by step, milestone by milestone, they kept moving forward. Graduations were celebrated. Dreams pursued. Futures built with the kind of resilience that only comes from surviving the unimaginable. Where grief could have hardened them, it refined them. Where silence might have settled in, they found their voices. Together, they helped create a non-profit in their mother's name, an organization dedicated to supporting victims of domestic violence and the families left behind. Not just awareness, but action. Not just remembrance, but protection for others walking dangerously close to the same edge. Because they understood something many never see until it's too late. Stories like their mother's don't begin with tragedy. They begin with warning signs. Today, her name is spoken in classrooms, at community events, and in conversations meant to educate young women about what healthy love truly looks like. Her life became a lesson. Her story became a shield. Proof that even in the wake of devastating loss, purpose can still rise. And while the night she died tried to silence her, it didn't. Her voice didn't end that night. It became a warning. A warning about the dangers too often minimized. A warning about the moments when fear should be believed the first time it's spoken. A warning that systems must listen and act before it's too late. But beyond the warning, there is also remembrance. Because Deanna was never meant to be reduced to the worst thing that happened to her. She was a mother, a daughter, a sister, a dreamer with chapters of her life still unwritten. And for those who love her, she remains all of those things. Not just a victim, but a light that refuses to go out. The most haunting part of this story isn't just the violence that ended her life. It's the timeline, the warnings, the calls for help, the moments where the outcome still could have changed. Because long before that house filled with water, before the silence on the other end of a 911 call, before a family was forced to kick down a door no loved one should ever have to open, there were chances to stop it, chances to intervene, chances to listen, and maybe, chances to save her. The most terrifying part of this case is not how she died. It's how many opportunities there were for her to still be alive.